Whoever governs Singapore must have that iron in him, or give it up. This is not a game of cards. This is your life and mine. I spent a whole lifetime building this. And as long as I'm in charge, nobody's going to knock it down. And even from my sick bed, even if you are going to lower me into the grave and I feel that something is going wrong, I'll get up.
That right there was Kuan Yew. And that was one of, if not the most controversial, notorious speeches he had ever delivered. If you look beyond the absolute aura of this man, beneath the surface you'll actually realize he was Singapore's most notorious dictator who ruled with an iron fist. His government delivered order, prosperity, and one of the most efficient states in modern history. But it did so by systematically crushing dissent and blurring the line between governance and control. But you see, LKY had a problem. He didn't just build a nation, he engineered a society. One where stability was prized above liberty, and where the cost of progress was paid quietly in the freedoms of the everyday individual who never realized they had lost it. Through iron discipline and relentless order, LKY will forge one of the wealthiest nations on earth as Singapore's most successful dictator. So wealthy and so well governed that it will become the poster child for decades to come. When you think of Singapore today, you think of a developed society. You think gleaming skyscrapers, immaculate streets, and a hyper-efficient city that seems almost frictionless. However, it wasn't always like that. In the years following independence, Singapore was a fractured, impoverished port city, plagued by ethnic tensions, organized crime, housing shortages, and unemployment. Survival, not ideology, was the priority. And out of that desperation emerged a form of governance willing to trade civil liberties for order, discipline, and rapid economic transformation.
Be firm, be calm. We are going to have a multiracial nation in Singapore. We will set the example. This is not a Malay nation, this is not a Chinese nation, this is not an Indian nation. Everybody will have his place. Equal.
In 1965, Singapore was officially kicked out of Malaysia. On live television, LKY broke down in tears, and many mistook him as a politician faking emotion for the cameras. But in reality, this was a leader who thought his country might genuinely collapse. No natural resources, no fresh water source, no army to speak of. 1965 Singapore was a tiny island surrounded by larger neighbours who were split by race, language, and religion. For ordinary Singaporeans who were scarred by countless riots and colonial rule, Singapore had become hell on earth. The island had become a slum-ridden, overcrowded port city. Families squeezed into single rooms or wooden shacks on stilts, with leaky roofs and muddy floors. Entire campons shared a few public standpipes and bucket toilets. At dawn, people literally queued for hours just for the chance to wash up. Unemployment was high, wages were low, and organized crime gangs controlled entire neighborhoods. Malay-Chinese riots had turned the streets into battlegrounds, with cars overturned, shops burned, and soldiers patrolling under curfew. Everyone knew how thin the line was between order and chaos. And for LKY, luckily or unluckily, that kind of fear creates something powerful. It establishes a baseline for a dictator to rise to power, fueled by the fear of his own people. And so when LKY came to power, the Iron Fist came swinging down hard. Harsh laws and painful reforms, including no spitting on streets, no chewing gum in public, and a style of leadership that doesn't ask for permission, but rather demands obedience. LKY's message to Singaporeans was brutally simple. Give me power, give me unity, give me discipline, and in return, I will grant you survival. And as Singapore's most successful dictator, he delivered much more than he promised. Within a generation, Singapore went from a shabby port town to a wealthy global hub. From slums to high-rise public housing, from unemployment to becoming the key financial distribution hub across Southeast Asia. The modern Singapore that we know today was built on the backbone of LKY. Behind that growth was strong capitalist reforms, an export-orientated pro-business strategy, combined with rapid industrialization, created powerful agencies like the Economic Development Board to attract multinational manufacturers, shipyards, and later global banks to the island. Let me put this into perspective. In 1965, the income of the average Singaporean was only around $500 per person. By 1990, it had jumped to roughly $13,000 per person, and by the 2010s, Singapore was matching or surpassing many Western economies in GDP per capita. However, every miracle has a price tag, and for Singaporeans, part of that price was paid in freedom. Here's the thing though, LKY was smart. He didn't want his society to be known as a dictatorship, and so Singapore kept its elections and no parliaments were dissolved. On paper, it was a parliamentary democracy. In practice, Singapore had become a dictatorship, masked as a highly capitalist free market society. And at the heart of LKY's quest for complete and utter control, he introduced the Internal Security Act, otherwise known as the ISA. It allowed the Singaporean state to detain people without trial if they're considered a threat to national security. And on the surface, it sounds somewhat reasonable if you picture a nation riddled with terrorists and armed revolutionaries. Not surprisingly, LKY's Internal Security Act was reflective of some of Stalin's policies during the USSR era, and we know exactly how that turned out. The thing was, Singapore had long evolved beyond that. In 1963, before full independence, Singapore's security forces launched Operation Cold Store. In one coordinated swoop, more than 100 left-wing politicians, trade unionists, and activists were arrested and detained without trial. Many of them belonged to Barisan Socialis, a powerful left-wing party that was LKY's main rival at the time. The official narrative was staged and dramatic. LKY labeled these as dangerous communists, plotting insurrection and violence. The alternate view, which you will still hear from historians and even some of the detainees themselves, is far more blunt. Operation Cold Store was a preemptive political purge to remove the oppositions to LKY's reign, masked as national security. For those accused, detention under the ISA didn't mean a quick trial and a fair jury. It meant years of your life put on hold, with no judge, no jury, and no public evidence. This is exactly how you build a successful dictatorship without tearing up the constitution or evoking riots from your own people. You don't cancel elections, but rather systematically eliminate any of those who challenge you and send a message to anyone else. If you challenge me, you will rot in prison. And the thing is, this was just the start of LKY's regime. LKY didn't just control who could oppose him. He tried to control how society itself was structured. And in Singapore, there's one lever that's almost more powerful than anything else: public housing. Unique to Singapore, roughly 80% of Singaporeans live in government-built flats known as HDBs. These aren't fringe welfare projects. They are the country's main housing market, giving power to whoever was able to shape HDB policy. In 1989, the government introduced the Ethnic Integration Policy, or EIP. On paper, the goal was noble: prevent racial enclaves and reduce the risk of ethnic tension by making sure every housing block and neighborhood had a mix of Chinese, Malay, Indian, and other residents. The mechanism was simple but powerful. Each block got ethnic quotas, and once a certain group's quota in that block was filled, families from that group would find it harder or sometimes impossible to buy a flat there. The policy is still in place today, and many supporters argue this is exactly why Singapore has not had any major ethnic riots since the late 1960s. Unlike the West, where we feel like there's such a strong racial divide in certain countries, kids of different backgrounds grow up side by side in Singapore, sharing lifts, playgrounds, and schools together. However, critics also point out a darker side of the policy. In a quote-unquote capitalism-led society, your ability to buy or sell a home isn't just about money. It's about your race. And at the end of the day, the state, not the individual, ultimately decides where you live, who you live with, and how you live. Taken individually, many of LKY's policies can be defended in the public interests of safety and harmony. But together they paint a picture of a society that takes governance and control to extreme levels. It decides who your neighbors are, what you read, and how safe it is to challenge the story that you're told. Sounds a lot like a dictatorship to me. That being said, it's important to approach LKY's reign and political policies with a level of contextual perspective. I recognize that it's easy for me to criticize his policies behind a camera when I wasn't the one who experienced Singapore in the 1960s. I wasn't the one in a crippled economy. I wasn't the one facing riots, and I wasn't the one having to line up 3 hours every day for fresh water. While I absolutely agree that some of his policies are reflective of a dictatorship, I can't ignore what LKY has built and the endless opportunities he's provided to his people over his 5 decades of service. Economic growth, safe affordable housing, low crime, low corruption, and the establishment of Southeast Asia's modern-day financial hub are not easy feats. Call LKY whatever you want, a benevolent dictator, a managed democrat. But if you look beyond the surface, that's the real genius and danger behind LKY's lasting legacy. He proved in his regime that you can trade away slices of freedom piece by piece, and in return build a nation that is safe, wealthy, and astonishingly efficient. No coups, no civil war, no chaos. Just a quiet deal whispered from the halls of parliament to the slums and suburbs. Give me your freedom, and I will give you peace. I'll let you decide if it's worth it.